Well, hello, we're back here with Terror and Horror in Volume 1, Chapter 7 of Radcliffe. Moving to the first slide. Okay, snooping around in Radcliffe. Radcliffe's the Italian, looking for episodes of horror and terror, episodes of horror, episodes of terror, episodes of horror and terror. I think I'm especially interested in that, the third. But we'll take terror first for the very good reason, if this turns out to be the case, that terror tends to give way to horror much more often than the other way around, though you will find instances in which, I think we're going to see one here in a few moments, horror gives way to terror. The natural progression seems to be terror giving way to horror, and we'll be able to understand that, I think, before too long. But let's begin with that famous classic statement by Radcliffe on the supernatural in poetry, which is familiar to you from Monday's class. Terror and horror are so far opposite that the first expands the soul and awakens the faculties to a higher degree of life. The other, horror, contracts, freezes, and nearly annihilates them. So if we're going to look for terror, as I've suggested that we do, look for episodes of terror to begin with here in Radcliffe's The Italian, what will we be looking for other than episodes of soul expansion, to use the language of Radcliffe? Episodes of soul expansion, ones in which the faculties are stirred, quickened, animated. Do we have any of those in The Italian? Of course we do. Next slide. An episode of soul expansion, an episode in which the faculties are stirred, quickened, animated, an episode in which the feelings are engaged, emotions are stimulated. What do we have here, right? You are too, this is the voice of the monk. You are too late, said a sudden voice beside Vivaldi, who instantly recognized the thrilling accents of the monk. Notice how those accents of the monk are characterized as thrilling. It is past midnight. She departed an hour ago. Look to your steps. Though thrilled, just in case we missed it the first time, though thrilled by this well-known voice, Vivaldi scarcely yielded to his feelings for a moment. These feelings that had been stirred, indeed. But checking the question which would have asked who departed, he, by a sudden spring, endeavored to seize the intruder. So you can see that he's engaged, stirred, quickened, stimulated in a number of different directions at the same time, as is Paulo, who in the first hurry of his alarm fires a pistol, which is a little event that's explained later on. It actually has a consequence that's not explained immediately. And Paulo then, of course, hastens for the torch. You will notice down below that darkness baffles. He doesn't get it soon enough. And darkness, which has been a feature of the entire encounter, and baffles when it falls, the darkness, or when it persists, baffles Paulo, baffles Vivaldi. The next sentence. So certainly did Vivaldi believe himself to have leapt upon the spot whence the voice proceeded, that on reaching it he instantly extended his arms, and searching around expected every moment to find his enemy in his grasp. In the darkness, of course, he is baffled. This darkness is, in so many ways, a hallmark of the episode of terror, this kind of episode, okay, this sort of classic episode of terror. Not at all surprised to see that darkness is a quality of this episode. And nor should you be surprised, given the classic statement of Radcliffe, that in fact Vivaldi is attracted, drawn forward, not repulsed. He doesn't draw back in repugnance, but he's sort of excited by this encounter. And he reaches out. On reaching the spot, he's not, you'll notice, he is not rooted to the spot in which he is standing when he has the encounter, but in fact leaps to the spot occupied by the object creating this moment, reaches that spot, instantly extends his arms and searches around. That is so typical. It's a kind of micro instance of what we see that we mentioned before, this investigating that we see that is so often insane when we see this convention observed in our various horror movies, right? You go down into the basement. We talked about this. You go down into the basement, looking around. What made that noise? Here we have Vivaldi doing that. So this is just a wonderful little example of an episode of terror, even though it does not give us quite what we might expect with respect to this phrase, soul expansion. And that's why I would like to move on to a different passage, which again is that passage which characterizes all of his encounters with the monk, okay, which we'll do in the next slide. So here's that slide that does give us, I think, some evidence of what Radcliffe means when she talks about the expansion of the soul. This is in, as you'll see over there on your right, Volume 1, Chapter 6, page 58 in the World's Classics edition. You might want to turn to it. Here we see the narrator's comment on the, quote, visitations of the monk. Right? All four of them. The first three. The fourth hasn't occurred yet. And comment on the composite visit, as it were, singular, that these different visitations compose. And we should read. He was awed, you'll see about 5 or 6 lines down, he was awed, Vivaldi was, by the circumstances which had attended the visitations of the monk, if monk it was, by the suddenness of his appearance and departure, by the truth of his prophecies, and above all by the solemn event which had verified his last warning. And his imagination, this is an important designation, an important distinction, his imagination, thus elevated by wonder and painful curiosity, was prepared for something above the reach of common conjecture and beyond the accomplishment of human agency. So here I think we begin to see some sign of what she means when she speaks of expansion. Now, we talked a bit about the faculties with respect to the last slide, but here you see them mentioned again. Imagination is one. I mean, moving on to the next sentence, his understanding was sufficiently clear and strong, which is a sentence that seems designed to indicate that it's not as though he was an especially superstitious character, Vivaldi. Down below there, but his passions were now interested, and his awakened, his fancy. So you see these different faculties: imagination, fancy, passions, which is, it's not that we really have a faculty of passions, that's more of, has to do with the intensity of desire, I suppose, that might be common to a number of different faculties. But there you have imagination, understanding, fancy. The passions seem to kind of point us in the direction of the faculties as well. What about this business of expansion, though? What do we mean by that? Well, I mean, go back to the very opening. His imagination of the scene, at least the portion of it that we're reading, his imagination thus elevated by wonder and painful curiosity, that alone, I think, points us at something, right? This, what happens when you wonder, when you're curious? What do you do? But you kind of wander as you wonder. You try out different explanations, and your mind races around. It ranges. Could we not imagine that as in a sense what she's talking about when she says the soul expands, as curiously you wonder and wander about looking for some explanation, okay, that's adequate to the experience of, in this case, terror, which, of course, as we said, stirs the faculties, expands the soul, right? Expands it to encompass a whole globe of possibilities, even, you can imagine. And even off the globe. I mean, this business here about, how his imagination being elevated was prepared for something above the reach of common conjecture, beyond the accomplishment of human agency, a superhuman agent, right, which doesn't belong to the earth in a sense. If you drop down to the final portion of this paragraph, that I think is an important one. But his passions were now interested, and his fancy awakened, and though he was unconscious of this, he would perhaps have been somewhat disappointed if he had descended suddenly from the region of fearful sublimity to which he had soared, the world of terrible shadows to the earth in which he daily walked, into an explanation simply natural. You can see how he's been, here we have this metaphor of verticality, right? He has soared upward. He is exalted. He's been exalted. His imagination has been elevated so that he soars into a world of shadows off the earth, as is indicated because he would be, when we are told that he would be disappointed if he found himself suddenly on the earth on which he daily walks, faced with this simple unitary explanation, something simply natural. So he's in the presence of the supernatural. And that seems also to point us at this notion of expansion and exaltation, which I think we have some good evidence of that in this passage. As a final note, maybe two final notes, you encountered the word sublimity in the phrase, region of fearful sublimity. We will have a subsequent video on the question of the sublime, which is very important to a number of these authors of horror, terror texts. The second little note here, we don't want to miss the presence of these words, the word fearful, this word up above, painful. His imagination thus elevated by wonder and painful curiosity. When he ascends, his imagination is exalted and he soars. He soars into a region of fearful sublimity. So fearful and painful. I mean, we are talking about not something that is delightful, right? But nevertheless, he seems to, in his own way, I mean, this is something that Carroll gets into. Why do we like this? Carroll tries to explain it. Why do we like that which is painful, that which is fearful, right, is a real good question. And it's beset a number of theorists of horror, theorists of terror. I don't know that we get an explanation right here, but we certainly have an acknowledgement of the phenomenon. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because he does like it. He would be disappointed. I think that's in some ways, the most, interesting little accomplishment of this passage. He would perhaps have been somewhat disappointed if he had descended suddenly from this region of sublimity. Fearful as it is, there's something about it that is very satisfying. But let's go on. Okay, here's that list of binaries that you've seen before. The first 6 or 7 or 8 of them. You'll see I've supplemented the list with a few items that were proposed or might be proposed on the basis of the scene that we had a look at a moment ago. Remember the business about Vivaldi's being thrilled by the accents of the monk. I believe that if this had been a scene of horror, he would have been appalled by them as opposed to thrilled. There's a kind of enchantment, okay, that maybe I don't even need to explain that. I think we saw some evidence of that in the scene that we just talked about. There's a condition of enlightenment, in a sense, is what we have in the case of horror as opposed to enchantment. In the typical scene of horror in which you're enlightened to the existence of something that is quite appalling. And I think we also saw some evidence in the last couple of pages that we've had a look at, especially the one having to do with the thrilling accents of the monk in that experience, that didn't we see evidence that in the case of terror, do you see something? I mean, he saw Vivaldi and Paulo both, if you read through the rest of that scene, they see like the skirts of the monk, and they see, that's a quote, they see they get these little glimpses of the monk, or this kind of apparition that appears to be there in place of an actual embodied monk. It's mostly a matter of hearing, okay? So I want to suggest, now I don't think this is anything more than a suggestion. It's anything more than something that happens a certain percentage of the time, that you have a kind of separating out of the different senses and an assigning of different senses to the different affects of fright. Certainly hearing would be associated more with terror than with horror. Clearly seeing more with horror, seeing in the light, seeing something that's appalling, something that enlightens you, and seeing it with a certain amount of clarity. You remember the line from up above, from Varma, actual cutaneous contact with the appalling. Yeah, you get the sense of touch that maybe you don't get with terror, where we got in the case of terror, we have disembodied presences. If you drop down to the bottom of my list there, more of a ghost. In the case of horror, more of a monster, okay? Obviously, Carol is all over this question of the monster and how, in fact, we know the monster is from something that's just sort of appalling but not quite monstrous. So we won't go back through that now. But the sense that you could touch it almost, okay, in form of actual cutaneous contact. I don't know that he quite means that you have to be skin to skin, okay, in order to have an experience of the horrible. I don't think so. I think that's figurative, really. Actual cutaneous contact should have been. I think I would have proposed the revision figuratively, not actual cutaneous contact. Although I think sometimes you can have that actual cutaneous. Cutaneous, of course, being an adjective having to do with the dermal, the skin. I would suggest that as often as you touch, maybe more often, you smell, okay, and smell so vividly that you almost get a taste of that appalling thing in your mouth. Anyway, and then how could we not, the word imagination being featured as it was in the passage we just had a look at, I think that belongs on the side of horror, and I think in the case of, terror. And I think in the case of horror, the counterpart is not imagination. Your imagination is not engaged. It's more your senses. We've been through this. Your senses are, again, not more frozen than quickened, right? But it's a condition of sensation that is kind of overwhelming. And you have a moment of realization as the full quantity of horror kind of besets you and comes into its own. Something is realized often. I mean, if nothing more than that such horrible things really do exist in the world. Let's move on. You will recall this scene. Vivaldi and Paulo are in the basement, as it were, the dungeon of Paluzzi, and find themselves stuck about mid-page. He had scarcely spoken the words when the door closed with a thundering clap that echoed through all the vaults, and Vivaldi and Paulo stood for a moment aghast, and they both hastened to open it and to leave the place. Their consternation may be easily conceived when they found that all their efforts at the door were ineffectual. The thick wood was inlaid with solid bars of iron, and so on. This is a very conventional scene to many of us who have been watching horror movies all their lives. You'll see how they're rooted in place, the two of them, by this experience. They stood for a moment aghast, horror-struck, before they hastened to open it. But here we have a mixture, don't we? The thundering clap, the sound, which echoes all through the vaults. Sounds like something that belongs to terror rather than horror, as we're going to see. But drop down. Vivaldi again. This is once they've discovered that they're stuck in this dungeon. Seriously stuck. The door's not going to open. Peace, good Signor Buffo, said Vivaldi. A truce to this nonsense, and assistant searching for some means of escape. They've given up on the door. Vivaldi again examines the walls, and as unsuccessfully as before, but in one corner of the vault lay an object which seemed to tell the fate of one who had been confined here and to hint his own. It was a garment covered with blood. And here, I think, we come upon an event, a little mini episode within an episode, here within this particular chapter within a volume, that is very significant to one who's interested in this distinction between terror and horror and how Radcliffe factors it, how she works it out in the fabric of her, no pun intended here, the garment, the fabric of her exposition. As we go on, Vivaldi and his servant discovered it at the same instant, and a dreadful foreboding of their own destiny fixed them for some moments to the spot. Once again, that fixing to the spot, that standing stock, still wonderstruck, horror-struck, okay, is something we've seen before, and that we know what to make of that. We know what it It serves as a harbinger of, with respect to the horror-terror distinction. Going on, Vivaldi first recovered himself when, instead of yielding to despondency, all his faculties were aroused to devise some means for escaping, but Polo's hopes seemed buried beneath the dreadful vestments upon which he still gazed. I think that's a suggestive image there. "Ah, my signor," said he, at length, in a faltering accent, "who shall dare to raise that garment? What if it should conceal the mangled body whose blood has stained it?" And now we need to move on to the next slide. And you'll notice Vivaldi has turned away. He has to turn back to look on it again. Vivaldi shudderingly turned to look on it again. "It moves!" exclaimed Polo. "I see it move," as he said, which he started to the opposite side of the chamber, as he said which. Vivaldi stepped a few paces back and as quickly returned. When, determined to know the event at once, he raised the garment upon the point of his sword and perceived beneath other remains of dress, heaped high together, while even the floor below was stained with gore. And here I think we find ourselves confronted with a moment of transition between these two, as they might be called, affects of fright. These two different emotional and aesthetic responses to fright. One that goes by the title terror, the other by the title horror. And we're helped a little bit by what's said in the very next paragraph. Believing that fear had deceived the eyes of Polo, Vivaldi watched this horrible spectacle for some time, but without perceiving the least motion. He is himself motionless in this moment. He doesn't see any motion in the pile of bloody clothing, but is kind of struck watching it, right? When he became convinced that not any remains of life were shrouded beneath it, and that it contained only articles of dress, which had belonged to some unfortunate person who had probably been decoyed hither for plunder and afterwards murdered. This belief and the repugnance he felt to dwell upon the spectacle prevented him from examining further, and he turned away to a remote part of the vault. Well, that repugnance, I mean, it sounds a lot like, does it not? Repulsion, that species of disgust, which is the term used most often by Carroll, right? That seems to be part of the affect of horror, okay? The horror of the spectacle. Spectacle, of course, is that which, often when we use that term, we're talking about a visual experience from which we have a very difficult time turning away, correct? It's a spectacle, it's a sight, and it gathers your attention and doesn't let it go, right? But notice what happens here with Vivaldi. A conviction of his own fate and of his servants filled his mind for a while with despair. And what I want to call to your attention in that moment is, in this moment, is this attention on the part of the narrative to his the time it takes, okay, the kind of passage of time or duration, okay. It filled his mind. Conviction of his own fate filled his mind for a while. So we have a explicit reference to the time, okay, that passes, a bit of time passing in this moment in which his, let's call it the affect of horror, right, comes into its own and comes into its fullness, right? And, he's thinking. It appeared that this is following his thoughts in this moment, what we call his thought processes. It appeared that he had been ensnared by robbers till, as he recollected the circumstances which had attended his entrance and the several peculiar occurrences connected with the archway, this conjecture seemed highly improbable. It was unreasonable, and he goes on. It was unreasonable, and he discounts at this point, or disavows, talks himself out of this notion that robbers are responsible for this scene, this spectacle, which of course keeps open the possibility of there being a superhuman or supernatural response, right? And this is a good time to move on to the next slide. So what we're going to find is that Vivaldi's reasonableness, it was unreasonable that robbers should have taken the trouble to decoy. You can only arrive at that conclusion if you've exercised reason, correct? What we're going to find is his capacity to exercise reason is something that's going to serve him well by the end of the book. Okay, it doesn't serve him very well in this scene, as we're going to see very shortly. But before we do that, and I think that tells us something about his propensity for terror, but before we get to the way in which this passage, as it completes itself, helps Radcliffe characterize Vivaldi in this very distinctive way, I think we should recognize another thing that is being done by the passage, which is to say a little bit about, again, this distinction between horror and terror, and characterize, I think, terror even more than horror with respect to this issue of reason. I mean, note again, up above, right, in the previous slide, the word conviction showed up. He's arrested, he's convicted first by this scene of horror before he then becomes reasonable and begins to employ his reason as a way of working his way out of the getting out of the conviction, as it were, get out of jail, right? He doesn't use his sword to get out of jail in the typical knightly kind of way that you can imagine some knight in one of the old romances breaking out of a dungeon or something. It doesn't work here, does it? The sword rather becomes a probe that you might imagine some empirical kind of fellow, a scientist, or maybe a detective, if we think of Sherlock Holmes, using the sword as a means of picking up and looking at more carefully that clot of bloody clothing, right? So I want to see that as an exercise of reason that leads him to this conclusion. It was unreasonable that robbers should have taken the trouble to decoy. Not directly, but the point is he's using reason throughout this scene as a way of working his way outside of that condition of horror in which he finds himself. He works his way beyond it, exercising reason as a way of holding it at bay and ultimately just kind of putting it behind him. And I think we get something out of this. There's a difference, is there not, in the this way that horror is, in comparison to terror, less captivating. Okay, which I know at first might sound paradoxical, because it might be a paradox here. There might be something just a little surprising about this when we think that your initial response to horror, when it's real, powerful, authentic horror, is to be frozen in place. You would seem to be beyond captive. You're kind of in fetters and paralyzed. It's hard to think of a condition of captivity more complete than that, correct? But I think is what's made clear in this passage is even amidst horror, your mind could, as much as it freezes your faculties, and at some level, the reason is still left free. What he's calling the understanding in the previous, one of those previous passages that we looked at. Your reason at some level is left free, and is still kind of has, amidst so much immobility, okay, we have, a kind of superabundance of mobility in the case of terror. In the case of horror, we have frozenness, immobility, a kind of paralysis, right? Almost a kind of momentary bout of catatonia. But the reason, the mind seems to be still working very often in these scenes of horror. Okay. Again, once the full measure of the experience and the full duration of the moment of horror, okay, has been completed, right, and the full conviction of the horrible event and the full apprehension of the horrible object has occurred, okay, imagination associated with terror, I want to argue on the basis of a couple of these scenes, would seem to be the greater enemy to one's everyday self, recovery of equanimity, to one's understanding, that's a quote, understanding, of course, being kind of like the everyday version of reason, right? Just normalcy and walking on the earth, that phrase that we saw in the previous passage. Imagination comes out of these scenes, it seems to me, in Radcliffe, is the greater enemy to the everyday, okay? Imagination and terror seems the greater enemy to the everyday by way of imagination, okay, than is horror. Okay, so in some ways, it's the bigger threat. And if this is not a point that has become clear yet to you, even as we've worked through this passage, that's okay. I think it will by the end of the book. Okay, so one of Radcliffe's ambitions here in this passage is to make this point about horror and terror yet another point about horror and terror, to distinguish them one from the other, and to characterize, I think especially, horror as well, but terror by way of this contrast, and to characterize it in the way that we've just seen. But I think there's another accomplishment, another ambition of this passage that works against the one that I just mentioned in a sense, which is to characterize Vivaldi specifically. He may not be superstitious, as we saw in a previous passage, but boy is he imaginative, and boy does he have a propensity for terror. Okay, because what we're going to see as we turn to the next and final passage of this, what's turning out to be a pretty lengthy PowerPoint narration or sequence, is that he exercises reason here, if only to find certain thoughts that he might have had unreasonable, not to an ultimate reasonable end. Because as we began this passage by noting, his exercise of reason points him back at a pretty unreasonable explanation for all this, which is a supernatural explanation, as we will see in the next slide.
So, yes, on page 78, the next page, Vivaldi continues reasonably, right? Continues in a reasonable vein. If this being had appeared only, said he to himself, this is above what's actually on the screen here, I should perhaps have thought it the perturbed spirit of him who doubtless had been murdered here, he continues. A portion that is on the screen, about 3 or 4 lines down, if he had either hinted of himself, he's talking about the monk, and had been wholly silent, his appearance and manner of eluding pursuit is so extraordinary that I should have yielded for once, perhaps, to the tales of our grandfathers. In other words, should have yielded to incredulity, right? Or credulousness, superstition, right? The tales of our grandfathers, and thought he was the specter of a murdered person. So you can see it, can you not? This continuing reasonable, which ironically is, as it continues, keeps the door open. He's going to talk himself reasonably into an abandonment of all reason on behalf of superstition. And in fact, we see something like that happen in the very next paragraph. Though it's not just talk, as we'll see. As Vivaldi expressed his incredulity, again, that sort of rational doubt, skepticism, about a phenomenon that seems to attract it. As he expressed this incredulity, however, he returned to examine the garment once more. So it's not just all talk, or all just talk. When, as he raised it, and we've seen this before, he observed what had before escaped his notice. Just below, you see again that he's raising it on this heap of clothing, the garment, on the point of a sword, which in this case is not the prop of a knight so much as it is the probe of a scientist or an empiricist of some kind who's engaged in kind of rational method on behalf of skepticism, correct? So you can see again, as he expresses his incredulity, he's talking to himself, as he goes about a process, as it were, the method of incredulity itself, right? It seems to be, let's see what happens. Does it lead him to, in fact, abandon some final remnants of his credulousness, right? Or maybe the opposite. Notice what happens. When, as he raised it, the garment, on the tip of his sword, he observed what had before escaped his notice, black drapery mingled with the heap beneath. And on lifting this also, he perceived part of the habiliment of a monk. And appropriately, that exclamation mark. This is an excited discovery, an excited observation. And the exclamation mark is attached appropriately to the monk, who, of course, has always been such an exciting phenomenon for Vivaldi. As Vivaldi continues, he started at the discovery as if he had seen the apparition which had so long been tempting his credulity. And then we return to his interior monologue. Here were the vest and scapulary, rent and stained with blood. Having gazed for a moment, he let them drop upon the heap, when Paulo, who had been silently observing him, exclaimed, "Signor," maybe we'll turn back to what Paulo has to say here in a moment, but maybe you get the larger point without my even having to reformulate it. Is he not succumbing to a kind of re-attack of that credulousness of imagination with the big I, right? To which he is prone. And terror, which so often assorts with imagination, just as horror assorts with perception, apprehension, sensation. Okay, so here we have some further evidence of that dynamic going on in Radcliffe. We also have, got the general statement, one could say, passage that points us at a certain kind of truth about the relationship between horror and terror in Radcliffe. Does it not also, as I said about a previous slide, does it not also provide us further characterization of Vivaldi? You will see just how prone he is to imagination and terror, that his credulity, okay, you see how the word shows up there in opposition to incredulity. He'd started at the discovery as if he'd seen the apparition, which had so long been tempting his credulity. His temptation to credulity is a very strong one, and it has to do with his nature. He's got very prone to credulity and very vulnerable to temptations, okay? Credulity here, of course, not to be identified with superstition so much as with imagination, as I said up above, and with a tendency towards terror, which by the end of the book, he's going to have to do something about that if he really wants to, as we say, grow as a person or develop as a character. So more on that on a later, or in a later video. Bye for now.